Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Josh Tewksbury. I am the Global Hub Director at Future Earth, and I want to welcome everyone for joining this Earth Day 2020 webinar on the links between health and the environment. Well, wherever you are, we hope you're safe and healthy during these challenging times, and our thoughts are with all of those out on the front lines working to bring this global pandemic to an end. And I want to start by saying I was invited to moderate this special session by Future Science Offers Mariela Antonipoulou and Giles Sion, working with the Future Earth Global Hubs in Paris and Tokyo, respectively. And then they are working with the Future Earth communication team to get they get really all of the credit for getting this event and getting this event together and bringing us together. I'll be moderating this special discussion, exploring the links between the crisis within public health, like the one we are living through now, and the ongoing crisis we are experiencing within the natural world. And this year marks the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, which is now celebrated by more than 193 countries to demonstrate support for environmental protection efforts and to highlight the need for important policy and behavior change. At Future Earth, every day in a way is Earth Day. We are an international platform for research, innovation, and collaboration, working to accelerate transformations to a sustainable world. And one of the best things about working in Future Earth is the opportunity to work alongside some of the brightest minds in science. And I'm really happy to be joined today by a distinguished panel that will help us unpack this timely and important topic on how environmental and health crises are linked. Aha. Apologies, folks. Just getting, there we go. Okay. Before I introduce our speakers, though, some quick things to note. Everyone except the panel is on mute. We strongly advise you not to open any links that are shared in the chat box back and forth, just for security reasons. We will follow up by sending a list of all the links that are shared back and forth that have been cleared, so that you can access those links after the presentations. All these questions should be put in the Q&A box that you can, which you can find at the bottom of your Zoom page, and our team will group them and share them with me for open discussion in the final 30 minutes of the webinar. Feel free to add questions anytime during the discussion, and if you want to direct your question to a particular person, just feel free to do that, and we'll make sure it gets sorted to the right. You may notice with some of the speakers, there's a slight delay in the slides advancing. So if you see that, just be patient with us. We will get to the right slide. There we go. As you can see, I'm already experiencing that. So I'd like to go ahead and just introduce our speakers in the order of their presentations. Peter Daszak will be giving the first presentation, and he is a global expert on zoonotic disease spread, and he serves as the chair of both the One Health Global Research Project at Future Earth and a member of the steering committee for our Health Knowledge Action Network. In his day job, Peter is the president of EcoHealth Alliance, an organization that conducts research and outreach around the world on global health, on conservation, and on international development. And Peter's research has been instrumental in identifying and predicting the origins and impact of emerging diseases across the globe. His presentation will focus on these topics and the fundamental connections between human and environmental health. Now, if I can get these to roll forward. There we go. That's Peter. So I'm going to go to the next slide, and we'll see if I can get the last few slides I have to work correctly. There. Let's see. No, we are not. That's not actually quite working. Okay, so I'm going to let's keep it on this slide, and I'll just introduce the other speakers, and then we'll go straight to Peter. Timon McPherson will be giving the next talk, and he is co-chair of the Future Earth Urban Knowledge Action Network and director of the Urban Systems Lab at the New School in New York. Timon is also a research fellow at the Stockholm Resilience Center and the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies, as well as a member of the IPCC Working Group on Urban Climate Adaptation. His presentation will focus on how shelter-in-place policies that reduce the transmission and impacts of the coronavirus are driving dramatic shifts in human behavior, including shifting demands for energy, transportation, internet access, and more. Timon will include results from the work he's doing in New York City, a major epicenter for COVID-19, and exploring how strategies to decrease the spread and economic impacts of the pandemic may inadvertently create independent cascading risks for our responses to future climate-driven extreme events. After time, Tolulu Oni will be speaking. She's an urban epidemiologist and public health physician at the Medical Research Council of Epidemiology Unit at the University of Cambridge. She's an honorary associate professor at the University of Cape Town and a member of the Future Earth Global Advisory Committee. Her research focuses on transdisciplinary urban health with an emphasis on generating evidence to support healthy urban development and public policies in rapidly growing cities. In her presentation, Tola will focus on the integration of disparate domains into governance systems that serve human health and support sustainable cities. And finally, we're joined by Sylvia Wood, a science officer at Future Earth based in our Montreal Global Hub, and a leader in the development of our recent Global Risks Scientist Perception Survey and our latest survey, COVID-19, Where Do We Go From Here, which captures perceptions of risk and opportunity coming from this crisis as we transition to a more sustainable future. Sylvia will be highlighting emerging insights from both of these efforts. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Peter, Peter Daszak, our first speaker, and welcome everyone to this webinar. Peter, over to you.
Thank you very much, Josh. Great to be here. Great to see so many people signed up. I'm really, my focus here is to talk about the link between the environment and health. But I'm going to really focus on one specific aspect, which is how is our global ecology and the changes we made to the environment over the last few decades, a couple of centuries, affecting the risk of pandemics, and bring it back to COVID-19, which we're all well aware of because it's affecting all of our lives right now. So I want to start by just saying we are in the middle of the Anthropocene. It's a time where there is an incredible change to our environment. It's been called the Great Acceleration. World population is expanding exponentially. And there are many good things about the Anthropocene that affect our health. Our GDP is increasing. We've got this wealthier population around the world. Of course, there's great disparity in wealth and great disparity in the health impacts. But in general, for most people, they feel a lot better off than when they look back in history of the last 100 years. But of course, there's an impact of this incredible expansion of our species on the planet, expansion of our livestock production, expansion of our trade and travel networks has caused a really significant change to the planet. And that's why it's called the Anthropocene. We dominate the planet now. We've made fundamental changes to the planet's physical and chemical structure. And of course, we all look to the increasing carbon dioxide and climate change as a key example of that. But there are many, many other issues out there that are expanding exponentially in step with our population expansion and our global reach. And I want to point to a couple of these. One in particular at the bottom left of the screen, tropical forest loss. Exponential growth in the loss of tropical forests, driven by our consumption, driven by logging and conversion of land to agriculture. There's also an exponential rise in the way we've exploited wildlife for food, for products around the planet. And though both of those have direct links to pandemics, which I'll show why in a minute. Now, one of the issues that we've been looking at is the frequency of pandemics seems to be on the rise. We've gone back over time and tracked every single outbreak of a new emerging disease, corrected for the underlying biases in literature. There are more people looking for them now. There are more scientists on the planet, and there's a big geographical diversity in where scientists are looking for these emerging diseases. But it's clear from the data that the events that lead to pandemics are increasing in frequency. They're coming at us quicker, they're spreading more quickly through our global travel networks, they're having a bigger economic impact, and they're having a bigger impact on our health. For instance, when we look back at SARS, which emerged just 15 years ago, it's thought to have caused about a $30 to $50 billion shock to the economic system. About 800 people died and about 8,000 people were infected. It took 2 to 3 months to escape out of China. SARS-2, COVID-19, the one we're currently experiencing, took 2 weeks to escape out of China, and it's already cost trillions of dollars to our global economic system. And as you well know, sadly, tens of thousands of people have died. We expect to see more of these in the future and for them to come more quickly. So when we analyze the origins of these events and we sort of track and say, what are the things that are happening in those places that could give rise to this issue, it seems pretty quickly obvious that this is a product of our global expansion, just like carbon dioxide increase, just like tropical forest loss. In fact, those things are causing it. So when you look to say, well, why we're suffering from this pandemic, the answer is because of the things we do to our planet. It's absolutely crystal clear. We've done the math on that. We've analyzed these data statistically, published in high impact journals. Other groups have supported this. Individual diseases we think about, like Ebola, SARS, monkeypox, Lassa fever, are all linked to environmental change, things like deforestation and travel and trade, the wildlife trade. And there are many, many examples. Every single pandemic that's emerged has a link back to wildlife. They're caused by zoonotic diseases. And if we think about, for instance, even influenza, which we know is that we get these new strains of influenza that emerge every few years and spread. Those strains are caused by the recombination or reassortment of genes that include wildlife origin viruses from water birds around the world. They mix with viruses that are present in our livestock, mainly pig populations, and human viruses, and then form new strains that emerge and spread. So what we're seeing with COVID is just one in a long chain of pandemic emergence driven by our ecological footprint linked back to wildlife. So if we look at the origins of pandemics and we try and analyze what correlates with them, we see three major factors. You know, pandemics originate in places where there are lots of people, high population density, where there's lots of wildlife diversity, because wildlife carry the viruses that cause new pandemics. And they importantly emerge in places where people are doing things to the environment that bring them into contact with wildlife. You know, when we look at the viruses that wildlife carry, we're not going to get affected by them unless we make contact with them. So things like the wildlife trade, things like building roads into remote forest regions to build a mining camp, to supply rare earth elements for our cell phones, are exactly what drive pandemics. So we're part of that issue, and not just people living in these emerging disease hotspots, but the people who consume these products around the world in the richer countries drive this issue. And it's an ironic sort of circle of events that once a disease emerges, it can spread very rapidly through our travel and trade networks and affect then the richer countries. So let's look back at SARS. SARS emerged in a wildlife market. The original SARS emerged in a wildlife market. This is a picture of that market. It's in Guangdong, China. These places are really perfect for a virus because you've got lots. The animals are kept live. They're mixed in with domestic animals. They're sometimes killed in front of you, chopped up. And I apologize for the sort of graphic nature of this picture, but this is what's happening all around the world, and we need to look at that and understand it. This is part of our natural footprint on the planet. Eating animals is what humans have done for millions of years. And what we're doing now is doing it at an unprecedented rate because there's so many of us, and doing it in a really industrialized way, including wildlife. SARS-2, COVID-19, also seems to have emerged from this issue. We don't know if the original spillover from wildlife to people was at this market, but this Huanan seafood and wildlife market was clearly part of the outbreak and amplified it and caused it to become essentially an uncontrollable event. And despite China's best efforts to control it, it did break out and did become pandemic. Now, how do we know that COVID-19 originated in wildlife? Well, if you get the genetic sequence of COVID-19, and those are the red viruses listed on this phylogenetic tree, this is a lineup of the genetic sequence of every known coronavirus, just about, with the red ones being the human COVID-19 samples. And then at the bottom of that red group is one called bat-cov RATG13. It's a bat coronavirus from a wild bat that we caught in 2013 in Yunnan province. We've got hundreds of these now. And when we line them all up, it's pretty clear that COVID-19 originated in bats, like many viruses actually. Ebola seems to have a bat origin, Nipah virus, Hendra virus, SARS-1, MERS, many others seem to originate in bats. Bats are very common, they're very diverse, they carry viruses just like we all do, and sometimes those viruses can be lethal to people. So this is not surprising. What was surprising was how quickly this virus spread. This is an algorithm that we've produced to track people's travel around the planet and predict where they're going to go to. It predicts connecting flights quite accurately. And what we saw in the beginning of January, this is sort of the third week of January, by then the Chinese government had locked down Wuhan, but this is out of Wuhan airport where people would travel to, then connect and travel to. And we saw that basically by the time the lockdown happened, it was really a little bit too late. People were already in Southeast Asia, moving around with the virus, spreading it within the community. And we also know that they were already in Europe and the US, for instance. And we saw the first cases pretty quickly emerging out of China. So where are we now? Well, we're in a pretty dire situation with 2.5 million people infected around the world, or have been infected, with significant deaths, tens of thousands, now hundreds of thousands of deaths. And it's not over yet, we're still halfway through. And of course, this is an underrepresentation of the true facts because we know that we're not testing at the rate we should do. So I want to just sort of think a little bit about what do we do about pandemics? If we're seeing this rise in pandemics over time, what's our strategy as a species to resist this existential threat to our survival? Well, unfortunately, what we seem to be doing is relying on vaccine and drug development. We're in this sort of situation where we sit here, we wait for a pandemic to emerge and hope a vaccine will become available. And as you can see from this table, most vaccines take decades to become available. They often don't work. Even when we have a candidate vaccine ready to go, it takes over a year to run that through trials. So it's really not a good strategy. And what I want to talk about to finish off is just what we should be doing about pandemics. This is rural Yunnan province, southwest China, where we do a lot of our field work. It's about 2 hours drive from Kunming, which is a city of 6 or so million people. This is a bat cave that we do some of our sampling in rural Yunnan, pretty innocent looking cave. Inside there are bats that carry the original SARS coronavirus, essentially every genetic element of them. We've now found literally hundreds of SARS-related coronaviruses in bats in China. We've worked with local communities, interviewed people. What do you do with wildlife? How often do you interact with them? People have incredible and diverse interactions with bats across Southeast Asia. We find that in one sample we did, about 3% of people have been exposed to these coronaviruses. They have antibodies to them, even before this outbreak. It works out as about 1 to 7 million people exposed annually every year. And it's a huge interface. So rather than sitting and waiting for a pandemic and producing vaccines, our belief is we need to get out there ahead of these and try and prevent them. We have communication programs to talk about the role of wildlife, how important they are, and how you can avoid getting infected or your livestock getting infected from viruses from bats and now from other wildlife too. We're working with the underlying causes, working with palm oil producers, palm oil consumers, mining companies, and the communities that work in these camps. This is a palm oil plantation in Malaysia. To talk about the hidden cost of this activity, of deforestation-related activities, the millions or trillions of dollars that these cost when an outbreak emerges. And we're also talking with governments about the wildlife trade and with people who eat wildlife. And I think that's a very important point. There are lots of calls from the West to ban the wildlife trade. It's naive, it'll drive it underground, and it'll make it harder to control when there's another outbreak. We're trying to work with wildlife traders, with people who consume them. These are fruit bats in Indonesia, which are commonly eaten and are being driven to extinction. So we're working with hunters to try them to set their own limits on collection. And we're working with the government to set quotas for the hunters to try and, first of all, make this sustainable and then educate people about the risks and try and reduce it. So I hope you'll join me on Earth Day in celebrating our planet, reanalyzing our footprint on the planet, and rethinking our relationship with nature, because doing that is not only good for our planet's health, it's also good for our health. So let's get to it, and a pleasure to meet you all. I look forward to questions. Cheers.
Excellent. Thanks, Peter. Over to you, Timon.
Great. Thank you very much, Josh. Thanks for the comments, Peter. This is excellent. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. I am just going to make sure that I have control here, and then we'll get started. One moment. Thanks, everybody, for your patience. Looks good. So about the time we were aware of not only the outbreak, but it started to occur in a little bit more in the West, as Peter was saying, as it sort of moved out of China along these airline pathways, at least as we can understand now, we started looking at some of the social impacts of COVID-19. And so with the group in the Urban Systems Lab, we first started asking a question: is the way in which we've been understanding vulnerability and risk to climate change useful as a method for understanding human vulnerability and risk to COVID-19? Are there overlaps in that? And just before I sort of dig into some of the questions we've been asking, I want to highlight a Future Earth publication of the last couple years that's been downloaded over 100,000 times, and I think has some important relevance now, again, as we are in this crisis, for thinking about how we transition and transform our cities to be more sustainable and more resilient to these kinds of natural disasters. In the Urban Systems Lab, we've been asking the question, first, what is the urban signal within this current pandemic? Can some of the methods that we've been looking at to understand risks to climate change help us understand, on the one hand, risks to COVID, but as well where there may be overlapping risks? So as part of a series of questions, we've been asking, how are policies that are being put in place to flatten the curve, to reduce the actual transmission of COVID, are these policies affecting urban life? As I think we all know they are. What are the kinds of policies that are put in place that might create additional risk or overlapping risks with climate and the kinds of extreme weather that we have been experiencing that are increasing in frequency and severity around the planet? And will this create additional risks that are unintended just from the way in which we are trying to deal with COVID? What are the questions that we need to be asking? So this is where I want to go for the next 15 minutes to kind of think about this. On this question of an urban pandemic, just picking up on Peter's comments, so far, if you look at the genetic shifts among the virus and cases that are being examined, and you look at human mobility data, it seems very clear that the majority of transmission so far anyway, is following these airline pathways. And if you think about the hubs for those are largely, if not almost completely, within urban centers. Additionally, the cases in terms of outbreaks and direct health impacts are strongly concentrated within urban regions. This is still evolving, obviously. As Peter said, hopefully we're at a sort of bit of a halfway point. It's unknown, given the lack of testing and inadequate testing, to have enough data to really know how this is either affecting or going to affect more rural areas. But there certainly seems to be a strong urban footprint so far. So we've been trying to understand a bit of how this is, who this is impacting, and the sort of equity dimensions of these kinds of impacts in urban areas. In the United States, which has quickly emerged as, again, at this moment, the place in the world with the largest number of cases, dramatic increases of deaths, social distancing does seem to be working in certain areas. But a study by the New York University has shown that the pandemic spread does seem to be explained largely, as in about 80% of the variation seems to be explained by population size, population density, and airline connectivity to other urban regions. So again, on this question, is there something about the way that we have developed on the planet, that we are now living in this urban century, that this nature of life in cities, but not only that, as Peter, I think, was discussing too, this connection across cities around the world has something really significant to say about the way in which this virus is spreading. And so there may be also some lessons there about how we can deal with this when we think about the urban nature of this. I'm going to dig into some work in New York City as a case study of an epicenter within the outbreak so far in the United States, as well as globally, as a way to kind of look at what we might be able to learn from understanding who's being most affected, and how this might interact with other kinds of natural disasters that we also have to be prepared for. So one of the questions we started asking early on in March was, and this is a map of current cases in New York City as of Monday. We started asking, is the work that we've been doing to understand where the most vulnerable populations are to extreme heat, to flooding, to other kinds of climate impacts, can this predict where we may see higher concentrations of direct health and even economic impacts in New York? And so in the circles here, I'm highlighting two parts of New York. And the upper circle on top, this is the South Bronx, where you see darker brown, more cases. And in the bottom circle, this is a part of Queens in Flushing area, where again, we see high concentrations of cases. So far, if you look at a more regional perspective on New York City as an epicenter, it's dramatic in terms of numbers, that over 350,000 cases are just in the New York City metro area. So there's, on the one hand, a question about urban density here that people have been exploring and researchers have been trying to study. On the other hand, not all cities are showing the kinds of impacts that we're seeing in New York. So I think there's some fundamental questions about how it's being handled here as well. Now, asking this question about who's most impacted, again, dealing a bit more with the social side of impacts here. Again, looking at these two areas in the South Bronx and in Queens, one of the things that we see here when we look at the uninsured is that roughly 600,000 New Yorkers are uninsured, which is about 7% of the city's population. On the other hand, if you think about city residents who are not US citizens, that's more like 22%. And of course, it's spatially variable. So when we've asked these questions, do some of these indicators that might create vulnerability to many other kinds of impacts of people's lives in the city, how are they related to COVID? We're seeing a strong relationship, and I'll explain this figure on the left because I'm going to show you a couple more of them. The bottom axis here is the percent of the population, and the vertical axis is the percent of positive cases as of Monday, when we just reran these analyses. And one of the things that we can see is that as you have more people uninsured, you have more positive cases in these kinds of areas of New York City. Similarly, when you look at communities of color, people who self-identify as persons of color, again, back in early March, we provided maps for New York City to show that there are, of course, hotspots where communities are more colorful in this way by people who describe themselves as persons of color, high density areas. And the question was, are these areas likely to be more impacted? And as you can see on the left, the answer is clearly yes, that there are structural inequities that have been plaguing not only New York City, but US cities, and I think most of us can see this in cities all around the world, a way in which the kinds of long-standing structural inequities and injustices are now being made extremely visible by the impact of COVID. So one of the clear findings here, I think so far, again, with the data, is that this is not hitting people equitably, but rather much more inequitably. We can look at this from an income question, and I think this raises questions for cities all around the world, and we have yet to really understand how this is going to play out in human settlements that have less data on current impacts. But here there's a very strong interaction between, on the right, again, I'm kind of focusing on these neighborhoods just to illustrate this, the lighter color being those that have the least amount of income, and in many cases are living below both the federal and the New York City poverty level. And the left side of the figure that you're looking at here that shows that the lower income are dramatically having much higher incidence in terms of number of positive cases in New York City. We see this again with poverty, similar kinds of trends. So just to reinforce this fundamental idea that if you live in some of these areas, here I'm zeroing in on the South Bronx, and the lighter colors are the buildings. In some cases, you can see high rises that have thousands of residents in them that are low income. These are some of the places that we're most concerned about that are already having high impacts. For example, living in Queens or living in the South Bronx can make you twice as likely to die of the virus. And so, I think one of the things we have to be asking ourselves, something we've been asking in the Urban Systems Lab and with other researchers, is what is the nature of the way in which we manage, design, and plan our cities that's actually reinforcing the impacts of COVID? So now I want to ask a little bit more about how this is affecting urban life. One of the things we've all seen is the social distancing policies that have been put in place to flatten these curves. We're seeing some impact of that. I think the positive news in New York City is that there is a decrease in the number of new cases per day. It's starting to level off. And for New Yorkers, but I think all across the country, this is good news for us, but also to see that these kinds of policies are having impact. But they're also impacting the actual life in cities. And so this is a question we've been trying to understand a bit. When you have policies like in the United States, stay-at-home orders, mandatory quarantine for travelers, large gathering bans, school closures, limits on restaurants and bars, state of emergency declarations, are people, first of all, following them? And if they are, how is that changing urban life? And I'll just show you an example from some social media data that has, at least on the surface of it, some initial evidence that on the one hand, social distancing is occurring. For example, on the left, you can see about 60% of all of the social media activities happening inside the residence. So there's more to look at here, but this is an interesting behavior change that is affecting other kinds of behaviors. Secondly, we're seeing more outdoor use of green space. And so it sort of suggests the question, and I think it's an interesting one to ask today on Earth Day, of how important is urban nature in high density urban development for our coping strategies. When we look at other kinds of use, we can see that transit use has changed dramatically. In New York City, subway use is down 95% since the shelter-in-place order went into effect here in the gray area on the right. We also see things like record decreases in energy demand as industrial, manufacturing, commercial use has decreased. So on the one hand, there's some really interesting impacts in terms of environmental footprint of this changing behavior. However, the big question I kind of want to get to, and I'm just going to finish up with a couple insights on this, is how, if the vulnerability that we're seeing in terms of who's most affected by climate change is also similar in terms of who's most affected by COVID, what does it mean when we have these policies that are put in place that are changing and hopefully really impacting the way in which we're dealing with COVID? On the other hand, last week in the US Southeast, tornadoes devastated multiple towns. The very next day, part of that weather system caused high winds and rain with localized flooding and power outages in the New York City region. In the Southeast, we're seeing extremely high temperatures One of my colleagues in Hyderabad, India, it's April, said it's only 40 degrees Celsius there already. In Miami, for example, in parts of Florida, we're seeing extreme heat relative to this period last year for the last multiple weeks. So all of these are starting to, I think, force us to ask, if you are having people shelter in place that are low income and that have lack of air conditioning, and we may be experiencing extreme heat, or if we look in the Gulf of Mexico at the sea surface temperature anomaly in terms of how this may impact us moving into hurricane season and typhoon season all around the world, there does seem to be a really important question now to be asking about the relationship between social distancing policies, work we've done to show who's most impacted by extreme heat, the overlap, if you go back to that circle again in South Bronx and Harlem, of places where we have high concentrations of people without air conditioning. What does this look like in other cities outside New York, and the way in which we need to be thinking about policies to deal with this extreme risk, both now and as we start to think about this kind of indoor heat exposure as well as outdoor heat exposure in our cities that are both going to be dealing with COVID for multiple weeks, maybe months, in terms of policies to try to decrease the impacts of that. But now we need to be thinking, I think, about the interdependent risks that come from here again in East Harlem, coastal flood risk communities that are experiencing heat risk communities, and these overlapping risks in what now I think we might simply describe as a multi-hazard risk world. If we've looked at this in the context of climate change, now when you stick that map of who's most affected by COVID on top of this, it suggests that we need to be thinking again about how we may have to have more flexible policies, things that can shift during the overlap of these kinds of events. I think maybe just to kind of wind this up, what are asking both our policymakers, our planners, and our designers to think about the nature of multi-hazard risk in this context of COVID and climate. And so I'm going to stop there. I'm going to just end with this hopefully provocative question about the way in which we need to be thinking about interdependent and cascading risks. And I just want to thank the members of the lab who've contributed to this and some of the funders. And you can see more of this work on our website. Thank you so much.
That's great, Tan. Thanks so much. I'm going to pass the baton to Tolu here. Tolu, I think you have control.
Okay. Just waiting on.
While Tolu's getting set up, thanks everyone for putting questions in the chat box. And we're going to do a whole Q&A with all the speakers at the end of the panel. So thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Josh. And thanks to Peter and Timon for setting the scene so well. I'm going to be focusing on thinking about connecting some of what has been said so far around the emergence of new pathogens, new contagions in the context of climate change, and connecting that more broadly to the concept of planetary health and thinking forwards. And importantly, I'm going to focus on thinking about prevention. But before I do, I think it's important to set the context. Following on from Timon's talk, I think you gave a really convincing overview of the role of cities in a big city like New York. But I thought it would be important for us to zoom out a little bit and get a global perspective, both on urbanization and on health today, because we know that managing these emergencies in the context of the kind of urbanization will be increasingly important, but so too will be the prevention of these interdependent risks that you mentioned, because they don't necessarily always cascade into full-blown disasters or emergencies. So first, thinking about urbanization. This first chart here just demonstrates the scale and the urban growth that we're seeing globally and where that is happening. So you can see each of the regions there, North America, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Europe. You can see if you look at Europe and North America, there's one blob because really there's not that much urban growth happening. If by comparison to Asia and Africa in particular, where you can see the different colors of those circles indicate the growth over the next or over a 50-year period. To put it into more graphic context, these numbers show you the hourly growth in cities across the world. So you could start to see where, you know, the cities that we normally think about when we think about urbanization, we think about climate change, and we think about are not necessarily the same cities that are actually growing phenomenally large. So we see Lagos has 56 people per hour. Delhi has 60 people per hour compared to 10 in London where I am. So it just gives you a sense of the urban growth and that dynamic of where we're going with things. So, so that's urbanization. From a health perspective, if we look at the global crude death rates per 100,000 population, this is something we know intuitively globally, the significant death rate per 100,000 population from things like heart disease, stroke, lower respiratory tract infections, respiratory disease, COPD, cancers, diabetes, etc. But we often sometimes think that those happen only in some parts of the world and not everywhere. So if you remember where the urban growth I showed is happening, if we break this down by the different World Bank categories of countries from low income to lower middle, upper middle, and high income, and look at the top 10 causes of crude death rates per 100,000, you see that we still have, even in the low income, even lower middle income, that same similar, the hierarchies might differ, but in the top 10 we still have diabetes in lower middle countries, we still have ischemic heart disease, still have strokes. So it's just to recalibrate us, just to make sure that we're on the same page when we think about health and when we think about urban. Okay, so moving on to the planetary side of things and thinking about what the implications are for urbanization. I guess we haven't really talked about the notion of planetary health, which is essentially a concept that recognizes the fine balance between human health and the natural systems that we depend on. And when you think about it that way, it helps you think about the fact that not only do our activities impact on the planet, but actually the ecological disruptions that we engender also impact on our health. So I've used this triangle that those working in infectious diseases might be familiar with. When you think about the interactions and how diseases are transmitted, we normally think about the triangle between the host, the pathogen, and the environment. I would encourage you when thinking about, I've called it the contagion and not a pathogen, because in the context of the environmental, we can think about pathogens, we can think about pollutants as contagions that impact on health. So if we look at that first line of side of the triangle in terms of the contagion and the environment, I think Peter's talk covered that quite extensively, so I won't touch on that. But if we think about factors that influence transmission as the interaction between the hosts, us, and the environment, and factors that influence vulnerability upon exposure to a contagion, we start to realize how many different parts of society play a role in planetary health. So for example, when we think about transmission, particularly in the urban context, you think about the scourge of homelessness in rich, often very rich big countries. We think about informality and the density of and inadequacy of housing. We think about the digital divide, because communication is something that we often forget in thinking about how things are transmitted. So your access to information, whether that is the correct information or mis or disinformation, really is connected to your connectivity. And when you think about the vulnerability of the host upon exposure to a particular contagion, key characteristics of the urban environment, like the air pollution, both outdoor and indoor, we know increase your risk of respiratory disease, which make you more susceptible. We know that in the context of COVID at the moment. We see in the context of rapid urbanization, food environments that are transitioning into predominance of highly processed and undernutritious food, if you can call it that. And so we're seeing this rise of a double burden of malnutrition, where you have both underweight and overweight occurring simultaneously, increasing your risk of diabetes, increasing your risk of cardiovascular disease, which also increase the vulnerability to disease and the risk of a poor outcome, risk of death, having had the disease. And lastly, we think about healthcare as an exposure and a determinant that impacts on vulnerability. We know, and this is a global situation across lower middle income, upper middle and high income, the inequitable access to healthcare, which Timon has alluded to in the US, really impacts on the vulnerability. And we see that playing out in New York as Timon showed. And so, if we just take stock of where we are now so far, thinking about urbanization and where we are as a society. So we have set up societies that regularly and increasingly disrupt the ecologies that we depend on. We are urbanizing ways that facilitate transmission and that increase vulnerability to disease. Amongst huge sectors of society. We have a majority in certain parts of the world with poor access to healthcare, poor access to prevention, be that vaccination or other non-biomedical, poor access to ability to protect oneself, and I'll touch on that. Because actually, if we go back one, in the middle of that triangle, is thinking about the protection both from a pathogen and from something like climate change. We think about the control measures that have been instigated, things like physical distancing. Your ability to actually respond to that is highly dependent on where you live. It's highly dependent on your connectivity. It's very dependent on your ability to stay at home and shelter in place. Depends on your food system, what you can access. So we need to think about these vulnerabilities and risk of transmission, not just in terms of acquiring disease, but even responding and to control measures. But I don't think all is lost, and I think it's important that we don't get too despondent, because that's not the focus of the talk. But I hope that from the slide so far, I've demonstrated that to address this or future health or environmental emergencies, we have to address those social, the environmental, the political determinants of vulnerability, of access, of risk of transmission. And that response is not limited to one sector. So only one of those pictures in that triangle related to the healthcare sector. But instead, we need a whole society approach. And really, it's quite short-sighted of us to either wait until diseases occur or to focus on health at the detriment of ecological boundaries. But here's some hard truths. Because insofar as we've seen an unprecedented ability of society to rally together and respond to this pandemic, I can't help but ask, how are we able to do so comprehensively, given our deficiencies in addressing arguably more existential emergency of climate change? And I think in order to process this a little bit before I come to the solution as a last, or proposal as a last point, I think there are two aspects of biases that we need to confront. The first is our biases in terms of risk perception. Because I think as human beings, we struggle when the cause and effect are not side by side. So would we have responded so effectively if exposure to COVID meant people got sick 3 years later? Would we have responded so effectively if exposure in New York meant disease in Singapore? So if the disconnect was in time and space, but that's the reality of air pollution, that's the reality of greenhouse emissions. There's this disconnect in time and there's a disconnect in space that somehow impacts our ability to think about risk and sense of urgency. There's certainly some aspect of the impossibility of continuing as per normal at the moment that means that we pay attention. And it's really not possible to think about, well, this is a problem somewhere else. It's just not possible to do that with this current condition, with current emergency, which has been in previous and ongoing climate change emergencies. And when we think about heeding the call to action, how do we get so many people riled up and saying, yes, we're all about responding to health to improve health? Well, it helps when the ask is very clear and finite and doesn't require any structural or long-term change. And skeptically, it also helps when the benefit of what I do can be attributed to what I did, right? Much less convincing when I contribute and I heed the call to action, but it's not so clear where my contribution lies. And so if we think differently, I think we all have very vivid imaginations and we tend to apply it in the context of dystopic scenarios. So if we think about our imagination, apply it for foresight, could we rethink what health means? Could we think beyond healthcare, which is what we're doing at the moment for this current emergency? We know that the healthcare is important, we've seen a lot, but we also see, as time and show, the vulnerability and the risk is much more than healthcare. And can we think differently about who we engage with and how we consider accountability for health? And when we think about emergency response, can we think about integrating health and resilience into foresight in the midst of the crisis? We always say, well, after we deal with this, we'll look and we'll change. We will not. If we don't do it in the middle of the crisis, we will focus on recovering. There's never a good time for prevention. And so the middle of the crisis is as good a time as any. So can we think about, as we start to develop tools to recover, be that investment, be that policies, can we think about prioritizing health, human and ecological health, integrating systemic drivers of preventable emergencies? Because we will otherwise find ourselves currently in this situation. Just my penultimate slide. It would be important in trying to address and apply that imagination to practice to take a systems-based approach to planetary health governance. And when one does so, certain things become clear. Firstly, there is a need for clear leadership to coordinate the intelligence needed, because these are not in one sector. There is a need for solidarity and partnership and collaboration across different sectors. There is a need to place health and resilience at the center of how we think about incentives, how we think about performance across all systems of society. And relatedly, integrating measurement for greater accountability. So to really try to bridge that time-space disconnect that I talked about earlier. And lastly, imperative to focus both on curative and preventive dimensions of health and resilience. This I will just whisk through quickly because, and I think this, the webinar will be shared and slides will be shared. But the idea is this is start thinking about integrated governance and what that could look like in the context of these interdependent risks. We've talked about the life supporting environment and the natural and the built and the social environments and healthcare as critical for supporting life, which we often only think about in that way when we see outbreaks and we see epidemics and when we see the lack of healthy behavior. But it's really important in all of this that we think about the the resilience factors in the middle of that. So if we consider the life supporting environments as the systems required for health, and we think about the life as the health risks and outcomes, the resilience factors are not just reactive, but also proactive. So that when we start thinking about intervening in an environment, you see economic growth being just one of those. How does that relate, and how does that impact on these resilience factors, and how does that connect to disease or risk of disease? A couple of things are clear when we do this. There's some cross-cutting things that we cannot ignore. We cannot ignore the impact of inequalities. We cannot ignore the impact of gender and how those play out differently. And we cannot ignore the fact that our consumption matters, and the demography and the life stage. And we see that very vividly in the context of COVID, where the population is predominantly young or old. These play out when we start thinking about governance for planetary health. And even more challenging, but really that I don't believe we shouldn't shy away from, the importance of thinking about those foundational disruptions, because we cannot have any of these in the context of conflict, in the context of going it alone and lack of partnership, and in the context of poverty. So those really are fundamental disruptions that we need when we think about integrated governance. And so this is a slide I'll leave you with. Apologies for a couple of minutes over, Josh. I wanted to flag these because these are words that it thrills me as an epidemiologist that everyone suddenly knows what we mean when we say flatten the curve. We talk about vaccination, we talk about modeling, but can we apply a bit of imagination? Can we think from a foresight perspective about flattening the curve of healthcare need? Health should not be primarily measured by healthcare need. We should be thinking about lowering the baseline for the need for healthcare, so that when we have emergencies that cannot be averted, emergency services and humanitarian services can actually react and to a lower baseline. So can we think about flattening the curve in that aspect? Can we think about vaccination beyond actual vaccines? So can we think about vaccinating people with life-supporting environments to protect the health and environment? Can we think about achieving herd immunity by addressing social determinants of health to reduce vulnerability? Because that's what vaccination does. And lastly, when we think about modeling, we've seen the impact and importance of epidemiological models informing what where the trajectory of where we think this pandemic is going. Beyond epidemiological models, can we think about value models of our shared purpose? Because in the midst of all of this, it's important that we take a step back and recognize the need to reassess. And it's naive to think that we all align with the same values, but I think COVID might perhaps give us a starting base point. So I think we can all agree that we all want a world where emergencies that disrupt societal functioning at great cost to human lives do not become an everyday reality. So how about we start there? Thank you.
Thanks, Tolu. That's fantastic. Really appreciate it. I want to pass this to our last presenter, Sylvia Wood, and she'll talk about some of the recent work we've been doing on surveys. So Sylvia, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Josh. Let me just get this started. So I'm very excited to be here today and to share and celebrate Earth Day with all of you on the 50th anniversary, and to talk very much about this important issue of the links between environment and health. And so, as Josh mentioned, I'm a science officer with Future Earth, and much of my work touches on our Global Risk Perception Initiative. And so I'm excited today to talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing within this initiative, and to try to highlight some of the opportunities for you to become involved in this initiative as well. And so, as my fellow panelists have already made clear today on this webinar, the risks that we're called upon to assess and manage today as a global society are increasingly complex and interrelated. And they're pushing past the limits of the current toolbox of techniques that we have for dealing with risks. We really need to be thinking about how can we be developing new tools to deal with these types of large global systemic risks that are emerging more frequently in the 21st century. And so 21st century risks are quite different. We're being confronted by an ever-increasing variety and abundance of complex global risks that threaten the continued well-being of society and the planet. And what makes these risks so much more challenging to accurately assess and to manage is, from those in the past, is at least two parts. Firstly, is how quickly now disruptions and shocks in our systems can propagate around the world through hyper-connected social and economic systems. So as we mentioned before, what emerged as a virus in a small market in rural China or in a city in China, quickly within a matter of weeks and months has now spread to almost all the countries in the world. And so the fact that these things spread so quickly can catch us off guard. And secondly, the fact that we've been building our social and economic and financial and agricultural systems and many other systems to be very integrated at a planetary scale means that the risks that confront each of these systems themselves are interrelated. And so when we have a risk event happening in one of these systems, for example, the health system, this can rapidly spill over to have consequences and impacts on other sectors such as the economy, our financial systems, our agricultural systems, and many more, and can create a cascade of events that are really challenging to predict and sometimes very difficult to stop. And so these two factors together lead us into a space in which we're now faced with global systemic risks with potentials to lead to global systemic crises, like the one we're currently experiencing now with COVID-19. It has become much more than just a health crisis. And in this era, the task is now too great for any one community of experts or disciplines to accurately assess these risks and to identify solutions that are going to work for everyone everywhere. The task is just too complicated. And so as we look forward to facing these sort of increasing elements of risk in the next century, as a society, we need to start to think about developing more sophisticated, pluralistic risk assessment tools and approaches that can help us to foresee these risks on the horizon, and ones that draw upon sort of a diversity of knowledges and experiences and perspectives to identify which of these risks are interconnected and how they're interconnected, and also to rapidly develop legitimate and context-driven solutions to help to address them. And so in this light, Future Earth in 2019 launched its Global Risk Perception Initiative, which aims to capture the diverse communities' perspectives on global risks and bring their voices into global discourses about these risks. And so one of the first things that we've done is we launched our first Global Risk Scientist Perception Survey last year, which targeted global change scientists. We specifically targeted this community of experts because they work and their study is focused on sort of a systems-based approach to looking at how people on the planet interact. And so they have a very potentially unique perspective on global risks. And so in our survey, we invited scientists to rank and rate the top risks threatening the planet over the next 10 years, and also to identify interlinkages between these risks that have the potential to lead to global systemic crisis. And we had a wonderful turnout. We had over 200 scientists participate in this survey from 50 different countries. And the results were summarized in our first edition of Future Earth's Risk Perception Report, which you can find online. And I invite you to check. And this is a technique that we're hoping to use sort of on an annual basis to gather insights from different scientific and other communities to lend their perspective on global risks and to help shed their light on what they see as sort of the rising threats to society. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what are the big sort of takeaways from this risk assessment. Well, first of all, it was really the interconnected nature of these risks. So scientists were asked from a list of 30 global risks to identify those which they thought had interconnections and that those interconnections could lead to a global systemic crisis. And so what you're seeing here in this figure is 30 different risks, color-coded by whether they're environmental risks, social risks, geopolitical risks, economic risks, or technological risks. And lines between them suggesting or identifying which of those risks were identified by scientists as having a linkage between them. And the thickness of those lines represents the number of times that different scientists link those particular risks. And what you can see really quickly emerging is just how many of the risks were actually identified as being interconnected, but with the potential to lead to a global systemic crisis. And in the top sort of right quadrant, top right quadrant, we really see that there's the environmental risks that came out as predominantly having the most number of connections amongst them. And so these are risks of biodiversity loss with climate change and extreme weather. But secondly, you also see that there are a number of social risks that were connected to those, including infectious diseases. So that was one of the risks that we asked scientists to look into. And what we found is, or what they found and told us was that they think that these risks of infectious diseases are related to other social risks, such as water crises. We can think of health and sanitation as potentially exacerbating or leading to particular types of infectious diseases. That there are also implications in terms of food crises that this may lead to, but that they're also related to environmental crises such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and extreme weather as some of the major ones, as well as other social risks, which we can think of maybe as potentially a consequence, such as involuntary migration and social instability. And so for us, the takeaway message from this part of the survey was really that we need to be thinking about risks in a much more systemic and global way, that they are connected with potentials to have cascading impacts across multiple dimensions and systems. What we'll also notice is that this community of scientists and experts didn't strongly relate infectious disease outcomes to some of the other things that we're starting to see in the COVID-19 crisis. Very few of them identified changes with or to risks such as unemployment or financial crises or energy price shocks. And so they were unable to sort of see those types of connections, which today we're experiencing. We're unable to sort of predict or anticipate that those might happen. And so that sort of highlights that while this community can lend perspective on one part of risk, they are not able to shed light on the entire spectrum of risks that we face. And secondly, the other part of our survey was really for asking them to identify the top global risks that as a society we're facing. So which ones are most likely to happen, and if they were to happen, would have the largest impact. So here's a plot of the 30 different risks of the same color codes. And what you can see again in the top right quadrant is that this community of scientists really identified environmental and social risks as being both the most likely and impactful, which is a little bit concerning because they also mentioned that these were the ones with the greatest potential to lead to global systemic crises. And so really highlighting sort of the precarious nature that we're putting ourselves in through a lot of these human-driven processes. Interestingly, though, they ranked infectious disease outbreaks as quite low, both in terms of the relative likelihood as well as their impact. So despite being connected to some of these higher level or higher, more urgent top risks, that this community didn't see infectious diseases as one of sort of the leading threats facing the planet at the moment. And so taking this type of approach of sampling from different communities can be really insightful because it lets us then compare between communities. And so here on the left-hand panel is a survey by the World Economic Forum and their Global Risk Report this year that evaluated the same 30 risks that our survey evaluated. And we can see now how these two different communities perceive the same risks. And what is interesting is that they did find a high correspondence between what are the top global risks. So they again also identified environmental risks as those that are posing the greatest threat to humanity at the moment. But they rank those as much less likely than the survey respondents in the Future Earth survey, which then we can start to ask questions about why do certain communities think risks are more likely or less likely, and what does that mean for our ability to anticipate and proactively take action to mitigate some of these risks. And so in the future, we'd love to see that this survey gets replicated, potentially with other communities, both science and non-science, to bring in more perspectives in on these risks and to give us a more full picture of really what are the risks facing different communities and facing the global community as a whole. And so this is something that we're going to be doing on an annual basis. And so we would really invite you next fall when we have our next round of the Global Risk Scientist Perception Survey to join us and to add your perspective on global risks, because this helps build out a much more complete picture and helps us develop tools to anticipate what types of risks are happening. But as Toluni mentioned, also we are in a current crisis right now, and we need to not sit back and wait for the next one, but to think about how do we address this one and how do we recover from this crisis to build back to be a more resilient community. So we're also exploring the use of rapid foresight surveys. And so we've just completed our first round of a rapid foresight survey, which we released globally on COVID-19, where do we go from here? And the idea behind this survey is to take the global pulse of the community to understand how are they experiencing this particular risk? Where do they see the world going in the next sort of 3 to 5 years in terms of surveillance and equity and environmental footprints? But also, what are the types of challenges and opportunities that they see emerging as a result of this COVID-19 crisis? Crises can be a time to restructure and to rebuild. And so we want to also identify what are some of the spaces that we should be taking action now in order to build a more resilient society to these types of risks and other risks in the future. And so we've had an amazing global response. We had over 2,000 respondents take the survey and contribute their ideas. And this is something that we're going to be tracking through time. And so we hope to be able to share the results of this first round of surveys quite quickly with all of you in the next month or two. But also look out for surveys coming across your inboxes that are a follow-up to this one. And we think that these types of foresight activities are really important for continuing to open up a dialogue on where do we go from here and bringing in multiple voices on these types of issues. And so I'll just leave you with that thought, and thank you very much.
Wow, fantastic work, Sylvia. And thank you all panelists for these tremendous presentations. I mean, this has been we've seen just a huge outflow of questions from the participants in this. Thanks so much for everyone for engaging. And I want to thank the panelists also for responding in real time to the questions that are flowing in. So if your question may have already been answered by one of these experts in real time as you've asked it. And we also want to make sure that those key questions are shared more broadly, and we use the 20 minutes we have here to dive into a little bit of a deeper question. And I want to spend the time focusing on the questions coming in from around the world to this great group of experts. So I'm just gonna pick a few questions that have come in through the Q&A, and please keep asking those as they come up, and ask panelists to engage in those questions. I think I'll start with a question from Donna that came in online, which is directed, I think, probably more generally to Timon. And the question is, how can we use the data we see now on urban spaces and disease spread to influence our planning in rapidly urbanizing areas such as Africa? And really, how do we do that more generally around the world?
I think one of the great opportunities that we have now that is very different than we had 5 or 10 years ago is the emergence of more and more global data sets. I mean, one of the challenges with the kinds of data that I've showed as a way to start to think about, improving the planning is that it's not equitably available all around the world. And there's clearly some global north, global south divides. On the other hand, from academia, from public sector, and including in the private sector, there's an amazing new resources, I think, that include resources for answering and asking similar kinds of questions in a number of the African nations. And so there was other similar questions I saw about this, but I do think there's something really positive about the new data landscape that helps us understand our situation better than we have been able to ever before. And it's an interesting confluence as natural disasters increase in frequency and intensity, our ability to understand where we are temporally and spatially is increasing as well. I'm happy to think about responding to that a little bit more, but maybe Tolu or Peter or others have some comments.
Yeah, that's great. There's actually a couple. There's a couple that are sort of also very broad and general that we could pass between panelists as well. Great. I want to sort of a related one around the communication space that I'll first direct to you, Tolu, and then maybe others can chime in. Which is, what should the policy be in order to communicate to people the connection between COVID and climate change, urbanization, and immediate health issues? And this comes from Panos. So Tolu, maybe you'd start, but I know everyone on the panel would have, some thoughts on this.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important to consider who you mean, who you're communicating to. I think people in their everyday realities intuitively experience these connectivities, right? And so the communication is, the means of communication is important, right? And I think often we try to take a blanket approach in ways that are not connected to people's lived experience. We don't recognize expertise where it exists. We only recognize certain forms of expertise, and I think that does us a disservice. So I think for the everyday individual person, the context is important. Recognizing that communication strategies has to feed into people's lived experience. Beyond the individual, I think it has to be a lot more than communication, because we have to understand what drives people, be that organizations, sectors, and understand, and that's the point I got to around value modeling. What are we trying to achieve? right? So, and how can we get to a point of agreement? Because I think none of us can do anything if we have no planet to live on. That's a fundamental. So let's work backwards from there and to get to a point of understanding. Because so I think it's lived experience and realities, whether that is an individual person or an organization, is important.
Would others like to chime in on that?
Yeah, Pete, that's okay. I mean, one of the questions actually on the in the chat box kind of talked to this as well. There is a link between, a strong link right now between climate change, air quality, and COVID-19. COVID-19 is a respiratory disease. If you've got asthma, you've got a predisposing condition. If you've got a bad air quality in your city, you've got a predisposing condition. And this disease is horrible at being extremely lethal to those people with predisposing conditions, especially the elderly. And as we heard from all of our talks, especially the people who are disenfranchised, poor, and in minority populations, it's going to pick off those communities first. And that's horrible to see. So let's recognize those connections and let's get to it to fix that problem.
Yeah, Hyman.
Josh, just to add really succinctly, I think in terms of policy and communication, it seems to me very clear that policymakers need to be focusing on those who have the most need. And this, and this is sort of the echo of what I've been talking about, but also what Peter just said, is the most need is not just a COVID crisis that we're seeing these kinds of impacts. This is a persistent subset of the population that's being most impacted. And I think there's a very clear communication that's needed about resources, and especially economic resources, as we move in from the direct health impacts to the indirect economic impacts. They're going to be with us for the next many years.
Hey, Timon, I wonder if things might change a little bit as well, because what we've seen with the social distancing is the public now understand that what someone else does affects them and what we do affects someone else. And maybe that's how we get to the more nationalistic, right-wing policymakers, because if they don't look to helping disenfranchised populations avoid infection, and like everything from poor people, people of color, to prisoners, to homeless, the virus is going to still be there, and it's going to come back and affect them.
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that we're all in this together. Everything is so incredibly connected. Hopefully we can all learn that.
Yeah,
Let's just add, sorry, Mike.
No, I was just going to turn to you anyway, so perfect.
Great. But also, I guess, potentially communicating that this outbreak is in and itself not the only crisis. It's sort of a symptom of a much larger global sustainability crisis. And as Peter highlighted, some of the sort of human-driven processes that have been leading to create sort of the inequities, but also the environmental disruption that has sort of created fertile ground for these types of viruses to emerge in our communities and societies and to spread. And I think it's important to think of it in sort of this larger context, that it's not just a global health crisis, but really it's sort of a symptom of a much larger set of problems that society needs to be thinking about, so that these types of things don't affect us in the same way that they have in the past.
That's great. And I'll just follow up on that and ask you to continue a little bit, Sylvia. And there's a few questions that came in around the survey, which and I think most generally the one that I want sort of to think about is like, how do you see this kind of a tool developing to have more and more impact on, say, business practices and governments? And in particular, I'd love to see panelists, you start answering that in relation to one of the recent questions that came in that really link that to behavioral psychology and the fact that more information doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes in, as we process that information or have information overload. So how do we design tools, policies, platforms, ideas in ways that help move the needle faster than we're doing today?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that our team has really been focused on is that it's really hard to motivate people to make change and proactive decisions if they don't have a common shared sense of risk. So if some communities think that they're really facing something imminent, and are blowing whistles, but another community doesn't see this as a particular threat, it's very difficult to get collective, coordinated global action. And so part of the process of doing these different surveys is to try to bring these different voices together to talk about why they see different risks as being more or less threatening, And they might be differently threatening to different communities. So, I am very lucky to live in a wonderful part of Canada, and I feel very buffered from many of these risks compared to other people, both here, but also in other parts of the world. And so my actions might not reflect their reality. And so I think having these discourses is really important. I think also trying to come up with solutions that are created from a number of different voices is going to be really critical for developing solutions that people want to buy into and take action towards. And so thinking about foresight surveys and sort of facilitated dialogues could be a really useful way of doing that.
Great. Tolu, you want to jump in here?
Yes, I completely agree with Sylvia. I think I would add to that your comment about people's resistance for change, that timing also becomes important, because we are generally not fans of change just because we're not fans of change as well, because things are just always better. It's always harder to shift from where you are now. So the opportunity at the point when there is disruption, because this current state of flux that we're in, no one can say, oh, hey, nothing is changing. We're doing exactly what we've always done. So the opportunity for talking about change and trying to affect a different kind of way of doing things is now, actually, because when the dust settles and we get back to normal, whatever that is, we start from the beginning of trying to convince people to change when people are actually just got back to what they recognized. So I think it's just important that we recognize the urgency of pushing for change in the current moment.
I'm going to jump right in, because you're so right, Tolu. It is so shocking how quickly we forget. And even now, I'm cynical about this. I strongly believe that in 5 years from now, it will be very hard to convince policymakers to fund programs to prevent the activities that lead to pandemics, because we'll be back to normal and everyone will think, well, we got over it, no big deal. They happen once every 100 years. There won't be another one for 100 years. Let's just enjoy our lives. That is the human nature that we've got to deal with. We've got to understand and disrupt. And to do that, we need to talk about it right now, even though we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and get the message out that there is another one coming, and it's coming because of the things we do to the planet, and we have to change our way. And there are so many things we can use, like the ability now to see that this global pause in economic growth and activity has led to cleaner waters, cleaner air, and a more healthy looking planet. That is a vision of where we could be. We need to really focus on that.
That's great. That's great. So, I mean, in some ways, this also speaks to one other question that was on there, which was around, that some of the speakers, and I think it was directed to you, Tolu, but in general, we're talking about fairly deep structural change that you're looking to, like how do you get to a new normal that is a more sustainable new normal? And how do we use science and evidence to help guide that path and create a vision that is, based in the evidence we have today, and is not distracted by the voices that are not following that path, that is supported by evidence. So I'd love to ask, all of you, and Timon, you haven't spoken in a while, thinking about, how urban planning, for example, has a role to play in shaping both the path we take and how the response to this particular pandemic is linked to the broader issues we're facing, and then maybe expand out from there, because I think all of you have a lot to say on this.
Well, I think that question picks up very well on the last comments in terms of this moment of opportunity, right? It's a crisis. People are dealing with this crisis in different ways, but it's also an opportunity. And we've been talking about this for years, that actually when a system's resilience is lowered is the opportunity for abrupt transformation. It's the chance where you can actually fundamentally change fundamental parts of our society and the structures that we have. So on the one hand, it's a crisis that there's billions of loss in just the New York City subway system. And so this kind of mass transit is something that we have to protect. On the other hand, it's exactly the kind of system we might have an opportunity to rethink and to improve. And I'm just giving a very narrow example, right? But we're seeing, for example, that the way in which we've been developing high density cities, the sustainability agenda around efficiency and optimization is exactly the thing that reduces redundancy, it reduces our ability to have flexibility and modularity. These are breaking down. The number of businesses that are closing is causing dramatic impact on people's lives. I think this is something that we have to, on the one hand, help them economically get through this, but not necessarily to prop up what we've had before. And this is a tough message to talk about, I think, especially when people are having existential crises. They've lost their jobs, they can't pay their rent, they're struggling to buy food. How do you have this conversation? And yet we have to have the conversation about fundamental transformation. And there is an opportunity now, I think, in the way in which we're structuring our urban systems to think about doing that in a way that's resilient to multiple kinds of hazards that we're going to be facing. And we can give some examples on the planning side of even how to shift that. The way in which, say, dealing with heat waves in the global north is a lot about air conditioning or cooling centers. Well, cooling centers is about packing people together, you know, in the tightest space possible to give them temporary relief. In the context of a pandemic, that's exactly the wrong option. So, you know, again, there's some fundamental rethinking there, I think, about the kinds of strategies that we kind of rely on, that are in place and we go back to, and that we have to rethink them fundamentally.
That's great. Anyone else want to lean in on that one?
And then and rethink it to where, I think is the follow on. And I think that was the life supporting systems and life image that I was the point I was making with that slide. Because if we're talking about any one aspect of those systems, we have to consider it's not just food environment, food insecurity, diabetes. It doesn't work like that, because if we're thinking about the food environment, how does that impact on energy? How does that impact on equality? We have to think through all of those, and everyone has a role to play in all of that. It might not apply, but if we don't think about it, it doesn't. I would say health doesn't trickle down, and resilience doesn't trickle down just because we have good intentions. So it really is that focusing on where we want to get to and considering all the different aspects of the system that we influence, and seeing the opportunity to both achieve what we set out to do, but also create health, because that should be something that we see as that we all see as responsibility. How do we create health? How do we create resilience as part of whatever we do?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So I want to just make a one final sort of comment and then question to the panelists, as well as to the audiences, to the audience and the attendees to continue this conversation. Because one of the things I'm seeing in the chat boxes and the questions is, you know, this sense of urgency. That this is a point in time that requires a lean in and an urgency. And I mean, if I'm honest with myself as a scientist, I know that scientists are not the best with urgency. We tend to like to analyze a lot and get things right. And there's a real value in that in society, but it also creates a tension for a community that has a tremendous amount of knowledge, and that knowledge needs to be at the forefront of the conversation. So the question really to the panelists and to the people joining us today is, how can we as an organization and our partners around the world help those scientific communities, these panelists and others around the world, to maximize their impact on this dialogue, so that we're having this kind of conversation, not just with 300 people, but with 3,000 and 30,000 and 3 million and beyond. We take this global and continue this deep debate about the future of our world and everyone and everything in that world. So parting thoughts from any of the panelists, would love to hear those, and a deep thank you to everyone who's participated and leaned in on the question box. We will save these questions. We will bring we'll bring some of the links to you. Also, every one of these panelists has written about this stuff. There's work behind everything they're saying, and we'll work to make sure that is also made available to everyone who's been on this call. Please spread the word. We're just getting started here. Any final words from the four panelists, maybe a bit from each of you to sign us off? Tolu, do you want to start? I'm just looking down.
Sure. I think you raised a really important point at the end there, because I think we do ourselves a disservice as a global community by having significant portions of voices being unheard. Our definitions of expertise, our definitions of innovation, our definition of knowledge is incredibly narrow. And so we try to learn from the tiny proportion or portion of what we are actually capable of as a global society. So I think an important aspect of that is recognizing all our biases, because we all have those, we all go to where we know quickly. So they're thinking, well, how do we reach beyond that and identify and broaden who we think of as an expert, where we see innovation happening, and how to facilitate more multi-dimensional or directional learning.
That's great. Sylvia, anything from you?
Yeah, I was actually just going to echo what Tulu just mentioned, that I think we need to be having these conversations not just amongst experts and scientists, that these are conversations that we need to be having at home with our friends about how do different people see the world evolving and what do they want to see the world evolve to. And then they can get involved, take action locally, and look for the groups who are supporting the types of changes they want to see. Because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution, even within a city, but there's going to need to be a diversity of voices, because that's what we've been losing. We've been losing our diversity, as Timon mentioned. And so we need to try to find ways to rebuild that and find lots of initiatives that can help rebuild the resilience of our systems. And so I would just encourage you to take this conversation to your friends, your family, your colleagues, and look for ways to move forward in the type of direction you think you would like to see the world move.
Great. Timon.
Well, I'll just quickly echo Tolu's point about raising the voices of those with indigenous knowledge, of those that are generally left out of the conversation. I think one of the things, at least I'm observing, is some amazing action by community groups, by people who are embedded in their neighborhoods or in their villages, who are organizing themselves, who are not waiting for experts, and who aren't able in any way to rely on experts or other resources to deal with this crisis. And that's not new. That's what we see during natural disasters all the time, but we can learn from them. Additionally, I think maybe just another point is that there is also a glut of real useful information. And I think people are on their devices, they're in lockdown, they're in their homes, they're probably consuming information, if at anything, at a higher rate than ever. So I think there's also an opportunity to say, this kind of information from people who have experience, all kinds of people who have all kinds of experience, is exactly what we need to elevate. And I would suggest to push Future Earth and other kinds of organizations and partners to continue these kinds of things, but also to elevate in place-based locations where that information can be useful to help us to plan responses, emergency response, but also to plan forward from here as well. There's an opportunity here. I think people may be, I'm being optimistic here, but I think people may be realizing just how important this kind of science and this kinds of information is right now, as they're actively trying to find out what's happening and how they can respond.
That's great. Last word to you, Peter.
Look, we're all part of the problem here. We're all part of this together. We're suffering from the same pandemic caused by us. And that's something that to me is so ironic and so almost cruel. And for the people who don't realize that, we need to tell them. And so talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends, talk to your family. Tell them why we need to be more sustainable in the future, because it's good for our health. You can start right now today by linking some of the tweets that have come out of this, some of the social media that's come out of this, putting it on Facebook, sharing it with your friends and all your contacts, getting the word out. For those of us on lockdown, we have this constant barrage of, we need to flatten the curve, we need to do social distancing. Let's change the discussion and conversation, start talking about what we need to prevent this thing in the first place. And that's a sustainable future, transformational change. Tell everybody about that. And they'll say, well, why should I care about that right now when I'm worried about a pandemic? And then you can tell them, and you can link them back to what's happened on this webinar and on others, and start to really get the message out there. So please get out there and spread the word, get involved, and let's change the planet for the better, for our health.
That's a great way to end. We're 5 minutes over. I appreciate everyone for staying on, and really, really a big thank you to all the panelists for taking the time to share your thoughts and to engage in what has been a really powerful discussion. Thank you all, and thank you all listening.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Great to see you all. Great questions. Bye.
Bye.